Once the fastest way to cross the English Channel by water, the Hoverspeed operation and its predecessors has been considered by many as the Concorde of ferry services between Britain and Europe, presenting speed and comfort that far exceeded regular surface vessels through the adoption of cutting-edge technology. Sadly, the economics of the Hoverspeed venture were fragile and difficult to maintain due to the restricted size of the hovercrafts themselves and the ever-fluctuating cost of fuel, the death knell for the Hoverspeed operation coming with the arrival of the Channel Tunnel during the mid-1990s, which ultimately brought about an end to the use of hovercrafts between Britain and France. The concept of creating a hovercraft goes back to as early as 1716, when Swedish scientist Emanuel Swedenborg proposed the idea of creating a surface effect vehicle that would essentially hover across either water or land in order to improve speed while overcoming obstacles, though with the technology of the time, such a notion could not have been achieved prior to the influence of the Industrial Revolution. The idea continued to be floated across various countries, though, throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, with shipbuilder John Isaac Thornycroft patenting an early design for an air-cushioned ship in the 1870s, while in 1915, Dagobert Müller von Thomann-Mühl created the world's first air-cushioned boat, which had a top speed of 32 knots. It wasn't until the 1950s, though, that Christopher Cockerell, a British mechanical engineer, developed the world's first practical and usable hovercraft in conjunction with the Saunders Roe Company of the Isle of Wight, with a full-scale concept dubbed the SRN-1, undertaking its first hover on June 11, 1959, though the British Armed Forces saw no real potential for the hovercraft in frontline military work. However, the potential of the hovercraft in civilian circles was widespread, with the model being seen with great potential due to its ability to travel at speeds far greater than regular surface vessels on water, while also having the ability to operate on land, and thus various aircraft manufacturers, including Saunders Roe, Westland, Vickers Armstrong, William Denny, Britten Norman and Folland, stepped up to the challenge. For the original Saunders Roe, this company would refine the hovercraft design into a commercially viable machine during the early 1960s, with their largest model, the SRN-4, forming the basis of a large cross-channel ferry capable of seating up to 418 passengers while also carrying 60 cars, followed by the SRN-5 as the world's first production commercial hovercraft. As Saunders Roe continued to work towards a large passenger and car-carrying hovercraft design, various operators became interested in applying hovercraft technology to their routes, the most obvious and highly trafficked being the cross-channel service between Britain and Europe, which was already struggling to meet demand through the use of archaic ferry boats and even car-carrying air ferry services. Nationalised railway operator British Rail, which already had its Sea-Link ferry company as a subsidiary, immediately took an interest in the potential of the hovercraft, this also likely being heavily influenced by a political decision by the Ministry of Technology to establish a publicly owned hovercraft operator, in addition to strong interest from other commercial operators. During 1965, British Rail, unwilling to front the capital for the prospective hovercraft ferry service by itself, approached various partners so as to combine their assets and launch the new service, with the two nationalised air carriers of the UK, BOAC and BEA, both being consulted, but neither showed interest as they already had their own highly successful jet airliner services between Britain and Europe. However, upon approaching the French railway operator SNCF, the two train companies decided to jointly establish a new venture to enter the market with, and thus, during that year, British Rail Hovercraft Limited was formed, though it would be another 3 years before it launched its cross-channel service. Marketed officially under the name Seaspeed, while adopting the then-new British Rail double arrow symbol as its logo, the management would announce in November 1965 its commitment for the Saunders Roe SRN-4, agreeing to acquire the first example, which was essentially a prototype, thus serving as the model's launch customer. As Seaspeed underwent development, a rival hovercraft company was also in its early foundation in the form of Hoverlloyd, as established by the Swedish Lloyd Shipping Company, following a 1964 investigation into the potential commercial viability of operating a passenger and car-carrying hovercraft service between Dover and Calais. In partnership with the Swedish-American line, as owned by Broströms Rederi, the two firms established a new venture in 1965 to provide hovercraft services across the English Channel dubbed Cross-Channel Hover Services Limited, though the company was renamed to Hoverlloyd Limited during the following year, and did in fact comprise two separate firms held under one banner, one being based in France and the other in Great Britain. Unlike its rival Seaspeed, Hoverlloyd recruited its sales and traffic personnel from the airline industry, many of whom were transferred from the ranks of the former British Eagle airline following its bankruptcy in 1968, thus meaning the operation of the Hovercraft service was conducted in a manner more akin to commercial airlines than it was a shipping company. Crew uniforms were sourced from the British Airways depot at London Gatwick, the traffic manual was based on the defunct airline's standard operating procedures, and documents such as tickets and boarding passes were based on an airline industry format. Back with Seaspeed, the company investigated various options for its intended services throughout 1967, with Dover, Folkestone and Pegwell Bay being considered alongside Lydd-on-Sea, Brighton, Le Touquet and the Isle of Man, though in order to provide a sea-link substitute in the event of a breakdown or poor weather, the prevailing mindset was to have Seaspeed services align as much as possible with regular sea-link ferry runs. Therefore, either Dover or Folkestone on the English side, and Calais or Boulogne-sur-Mer on the French side became the preferred options, with Folkestone being eliminated due to its small harbour, its inability to cater for large hovercraft, and high exposure to southerly winds, while SNCF, being keen to support the initiative, offered to build a railway line and station adjacent to the proposed Boulogne hoverport at its own expense. As for Hoverlloyd, the company exercised great attention in the selection of the most advantageous route, as well as the optimal sites to establish bases, the management electing a Ramsgate to Calais run as its initial service due to it possessing the perfect set of circumstances for a successful hovercraft route. These included a 10 miles out shelter from prevailing weather conditions when near the Goodwin Sands, while day-to-day timings could be adjusted to take advantage of both tides and winds, the harbour at Ramsgate also not requiring the negotiation of stone-walled entrances, which would have been the case with Dover Harbour, compounded further by the fact that Folkestone Harbour was operated by British Rail through Sea-Link. Thus, on April 6, 1966, Hoverlloyd commenced commercial operations from Ramsgate Harbour to Calais, initially utilising the passenger-only SRN-6 hovercraft, which initially illustrated a superb speed advantage over the regular ferry boats, being able to accomplish a crossing of the channel in only 22 minutes, but with the disadvantage of having higher operational costs that required a more expensive ticket price. In August 1968, Seaspeed commenced its cross-channel services from the eastern docks at Dover to Boulogne-sur-Mer using its first SRN-4, the Princess Margaret, while in 1970, Dover to Calais was added with the Princess Anne, though the French-built Sedam N500 hovercraft was also used from the summer of 1977, but while this illustrated an impressive two-tier car deck, reliability problems saw it withdrawn and scrapped in 1983. Between 1969 and 1977, Hoverlloyd would expand its operations into car-carrying service through the delivery of 4 significantly larger SRN-4 hovercraft, capable of carrying 30 vehicles and 254 passengers, each vessel costing £1.2 million from the British Hovercraft Corporation, and were christened the names Sure, Swift, Sir Christopher and the Prince of Wales. In 1969, in conjunction with the arrival of the first SRN-4s, Hoverlloyd repositioned its services to run between the purpose-built Ramsgate Hoverport and a similar facility just east of Calais Harbour, which was shared between Hoverlloyd and its rival Seaspeed, the cost of these dedicated ports being a significant expense to both firms in order to ensure the most optimised infrastructure was available for use. Operations of hovercraft across the Channel, while illustrating superb speed advantages over regular ferries, did not come without their problems, with early services being prone to disruption and abrupt cancellations due to the frequent poor weather, though improvements to the design of the skirts made them more resilient to the impact of high seas, and thus reliability for hovercraft runs would become more stable during the 1970s. Aside from cross-channel services, Seaspeed also operated passenger-only runs across the Solent using a pair of smaller SRN-6 hovercraft named Seahawk and Sea Eagle, which had commenced service on July 6, 1966, and travelled between Cowes on the Isle of Wight and Southampton, though this was later joined by a Portsmouth to Ryde and Portsmouth to Cowes service, which departed from Portsmouth Harbour Railway Station. Seaspeed services to the Isle of Wight proved incredibly popular, with 67,600 passengers being carried during its first year of operation, the most popular route being the Southampton to Cowes run, though tragedy struck on March 4, 1972, when one vessel was struck by an unusually large wave and capsized off South Sea, killing 5 of the 26 passengers aboard and representing the first fatal accident involving a commercial hovercraft. However, while the Isle of Wight service was still very popular, the British Rail Board, amid its own losses being made on the wider railway network, concluded that the SRN6s were too expensive to run to achieve a sufficient return on investment on any of the 3 Solent routes, and thus in 1976, the hovercraft operations across the Solent were sold to the rival Hover Travel Company. The matter of operational expense was one that dogged both the Seaspeed and Hoverlloyd operations throughout their entire existence, as while the cancellation rate for engineering reasons fell from almost 30% in 1968 to less than 5% in 1973, the Seaspeed company made a loss for every year of operation, with the exception of 1973 and 1976, when it returned a profit of £100,000 and £5,000 respectively. For Hoverlloyd, this initially incurred losses of £250,000 in 1968 and £164,000 in 1969, though the company did return to profit in 1972 and continued to do so until 1980, with profit margins of 10.5% in 1976, 10% in 1977, and 7% in 1978. Its financial strength seeing the Swedish Lloyd's stake in the firm be procured by Broström's Rederi during 1976, who became the sole owner of the Hoverlloyd service during the late 1970s. In 1975, Hoverlloyd was reportedly operating its fleet at near maximum capacity throughout the peak season, while Seaspeed proved incapable of matching the reliability record of Hoverlloyd, which consistently operated over 98% of scheduled crossings, while maintaining an unblemished safety record throughout the firm's existence. Hoverlloyd would thus reap the highest benefits of the cross-channel hovercraft service, with 1979 seeing a typical day's operation at the Pegwell Bay hoverport near Ramsgate witness 27 daily departures, with the first crossing taking place at 6 a.m., while the last arrivals from France would end their journeys as late as almost midnight, this year also seeing 1.25 million passengers use the Hoverlloyd service. In addition, Hoverlloyd sold various duty-free goods on board their SRN4s during the cross-channel transit, which accounted for 30% of their profits during 1979, while a connecting coach transfer between the hoverports and various European and British destinations presented a through service of coach hovercraft coach that was much cheaper than the comparable airfares by British Airways and Air France. Initially, Hoverlloyd operated 2 connecting coach services in the form of London to Paris and the less popular London to Brussels, while Amsterdam was added from 1979, though attempts to expand coach transfers to the German market, connecting with cities such as Cologne, Frankfurt and Bonn, the complexities of gaining a license in West Germany saw this proposal fail to materialize. Sadly, while Seaspeed struggled making a loss throughout the late 1970s and Hoverlloyd was flourishing, the economies of hovercraft operation were always based on very narrow profit margins that were easily undone by wider economic concerns or upsets in the price of fuel, as exhibited with the 1973 and 1979 oil crises, which saw the cost of operating the 4 Bristol Proteus gas turbine engines per hovercraft increase dramatically. At the same time, while the hovercrafts were able to carry cars, these vessels had not the capacity to transport freight, either in the form of articulated lorries or containers like regular surface ferries, and thus meant the company was unable to offset a decline in demand with other forms of business activities, compounded further by Hoverlloyd being a highly leveraged company, with debt accounting for much of its profits. The biggest problem of all, though, was the closure of the British Hovercraft Corporation, which cut off new part supplies and meant that new models to replace the highly inefficient first-generation units of the 1960s could not be readily developed, Hoverlloyd opting to withdraw their vessel Sure during 1983 in order to provide parts donation for other members of the fleet. As such, with both companies showing fragile profit margins, especially Seaspeed, the 2 operators had been negotiating since the early 1970s a possible merger into a single firm, though the Hoverlloyd management was not convinced the British government would sanction any form of arrangement between Seaspeed and a foreign company, as exacerbated when discussions became public knowledge and plans for a consortium were quickly abandoned. Ultimately, in late 1981, as both companies now faced a fall in their profit margins, they would merge into the singular Hoverspeed firm at a valuation of £110 million, while combined losses were £8 million, with ticket prices 25 to 30% higher than regular ferries. Under the terms of the merger, Hoverspeed was also under obligation to accept the two French-owned Hovercraft in exchange for a 10% participation in share capital by SNCF, with the company being spearheaded by Jerry Draper, new chief executive and former marketing director at British Airways. As with the preceding Hoverlloyd, Draper operated Hoverspeed in the same manner as an airline, and brought with him a wealth of experience, including his involvement in filling empty passenger seats aboard the new Boeing 747s when IATA regulations prohibited discounting, and was also a key figure in turning Concorde services profitable. Nevertheless, a number of early decisions plagued the new company, the first being that Hoverspeed inherited an antiquated reservation system which was inadequate, resulting in potential travellers having great difficulty in contacting the firm, while many were told that crossings were fully booked when they were not, thus necessitating its revision into a very basic manual reservation system to try and cope with demand. In 1982, loss income was estimated at between £3 and £4 million, while excess capacity drove profit margins down, the most damaging mistake being the increase in the number of crossings operated, which rose to over 10,000 during 1982. This expansion of the schedule not matching the company's potential demand, as was the decision to briefly reopen the Ramsgate route for the summer season. Furthermore, parity pricing continued with ferry operators even during the peak season, this being a source of concern, as 70% of the turnover and traffic was generated during the summer season between mid-June and mid-September. Despite carrying 2.5 million passengers and 400,000 vehicles, and obtaining a 21% market share with 35 fewer flights and 250 staff made redundant, the new Hoverspeed continued to register losses with £5.5 million for the year 1982 and £3.5 million in 1983. Meanwhile, the troublesome N500 hovercrafts achieved only 60% reliability and did not meet ride comfort or control standards, with these machines ultimately being withdrawn and scrapped after only a few years of work, while the SR-N4 craft could not accommodate the recently introduced double-deck and 1.5-deck coaches, thus excluding Hoverspeed from this vital sector of the market. Come 1984, Hoverspeed was facing almost total collapse, and in February of that year, the British government refused to provide further guaranteed loans, while British Rail sold the 50% ownership it retained in the company and its losses for a nominal sum of £1 to a syndicate consortium of 5 directors. Thus, Hoverspeed was effectively given away to its own management and was wholly owned within the private sector, being backed by merchant bank Kleinvort Benson, which provided guarantees and underwrote the cash needed to operate via NatWest. The company immediately adopted premium instead of parity pricing, justified on the grounds that a faster service was expected to be more expensive, while an aggressive advertising campaign was mounted against the ferries and more effort was made to target fares accurately. For 1984, the company made a loss of £621,000, but after the management takeover, its performance rose to a pre-tax profit of £194,000 for 1985, including an increase in American passengers, and 1986 would see a profit of £625,000 garnered. Ripe for sale, in February 1986, Hoverspeed was sold by the management consortium to British Ferries, the holding company of SeaLink UK, as owned by the Bermuda-based Sea Containers firm, a transport group engaged in marine container leasing, manufacturing, depot and logistics operations, railway operations, ferry operations and leisure industry investment, for a sum of £5 million, with each syndicate making a profit of £600,000. In 1987, Hoverspeed returned a profit of £1.6 million with a turnover of £42.3 million per year, and £4.7 million in 1988 with a turnover of £44 million per year, while due to it now being part of a larger shipping company, meant fresh recapitalisation, cheaper fuel, as well as access to legal services could now be provided. With the reduced fleet of hovercraft aging, it also permitted capital investment into more fuel-efficient vessels, with the first Sea-Cat catamaran services introduced in 1991 and larger Super Sea-Cats in 1997, the latter to achieve economies of scale in the face of stiff competition from the Channel Tunnel and the ferry companies. Despite the introduction of the Super Sea-Cats, Hoverspeed could not match the Channel Tunnel both in terms of economies of scale and pricing, this becoming apparent in the company's pre-tax profits immediately following the opening of the Channel Tunnel in May 1994, while in July 1999, the lucrative duty-free sales business model came to an end when the European Union removed tariffs between member states. with Hoverspeed having reported its last year of profit in 1995, by 2000, Sea Containers announced it refused to support the company's losses on the English Channel, and that they would cease operation on the Dover to Calais route after 40 years, the last flight of a Hoverspeed hovercraft taking place on October 1, 2000. As for the Sea Cats, it was initially considered that these would be transferred to Sea Containers' Mediterranean services, though in March 2006, both units, the Sea Cat Rapide and Sea Cat Diamant, were put up for sale, while Super Sea Cat 1, which had operated for Hoverspeed on its now closed New Haven to Dieppe service, was sold in April 2006 to Acciona Transmediterranea. As for the former Hovercraft, Hoverspeed retained ownership of the two surviving units until 2006, when both were sold to Wensley Hayden Bailey for £500,000 and were stored at Lyon Solent next to the Hovercraft Museum, followed in 2016 by their transfer of ownership, which included both vessels and the land they occupied, to the Home and Communities Agency. However, due to a need to redevelop part of the land on which the hovercraft were located, a fundraising campaign to preserve the vessels could only save one unit, and by the summer of 2016, it was decided that the Princess Anne, which was in a better cosmetic condition, would be saved, while the Princess Margaret, which had deteriorated somewhat, was broken up for scrap in 2018. As for hovercraft operations in Great Britain, the last public service still earning revenue as of 2024 is the hover travel run between Southsea Common and Ryde on the Isle of Wight, which utilises two 12,000 TD hovercraft vessels that complete the 5-mile journey in around 10 minutes, hover travel being one of only two commercial passenger hovercraft services in the world, the other being a winter-only operation in Estonia. Today, Hoverspeed and its predecessors are often regarded as a late-lamented part of ferry services between Britain and Europe and the Concorde moment for high-speed, high-technology travel across the English Channel, providing speed and comfort that far exceeded that of regular ferry boats, but at a cost that meant profit margins would always be fragile and difficult to maintain.